Listo.
Yo también empecé a grabar y me avisan cuando transmito.
Dame un segundo, que yo no tengo aquí. Es que el problema. Espérate, entonces lo leo del celular. ¿Dónde están las cosas, las informaciones de la conferencia de hoy? Listo, puedes empezar.
Se fue.
Buenas tardes, amigos.
Good
Buenas tardes.
afternoon, friends. Good afternoon for everybody who's connected in different parts of the world, different places, through our Facebook Live transmission. This is the second Latin American encounter for the right to the city. And this is a conference that we have prepared, a workshop we have prepared specifically to commemorate today, the Day of the Human Rights Day. Why did we choose this conference? To commemorate human rights and celebrate human rights. Because Andrés Comilo Rodríguez, Isabel Fajardo, Mauricio Esguerra, and Nadia Triviño have decided to confront an institution such as the police to document crimes that the police has committed within the framework of social protest in Bogota. So for us, it's very important because in Colombia, historically, it's been very difficult to document, to create evidence of the crimes committed by not just the police, but also the armed forces in general. And we wanted to ask questions who are directly in the territory, who are doing that work. We wanted them to be the ones to tell the story and show us in a more practical, close way of the exercise of documentation and recollecting evidence. And they would teach us how to do this so that we can use the tools that we have as citizens, civilians, to claim our rights. Our right to the social protest in this case, or our right to a life free of violence, violence free life, which is the most important, I believe. Our life free of violence should be guaranteed by the state. And that's precisely the paradox that we are presented with today. Instead of the state guaranteeing a life free of violence, we're faced with a state that exercises violence on the citizens, on the civilians. And here it's worth remembering what we spoke with Andres Hidárraga, because he used to say that just the simple fact of having a protocol to defend social protest is a disaster already. That is, as a society, that speaks poorly of us, because it's so obvious that there should be no protocol. It should be obvious that there is no violence that should be exercised on civilians within the framework of social protest. However, that's not the reality. We also evidenced that in the conference with Natasha, not just in social protest, but the simple pleasure and the exercise of leisure on the streets. Many populations are receiving violence from the state, police brutality, military violence, that besides, as we've seen in the different conferences, it's intercepted or correlated with racism, exclusion, lack of a household, stigmatization, and all of these forms of segregation that we are facing every day. So I'm very happy to be here today in this workshop Because as we said yesterday with Natasha's documentary, this is a way to show the world that we live in. And this front camera of the patrol that we saw yesterday actually accomplished. I mean, we almost died yesterday watching that, but that camera accomplished or got Schwann out of prison. And it got the policeman who murdered Alan at least attended military justice and were subjected to military justice at least. So this sheds a lot of light on the importance of those cameras, of where they are, how we should do it, and how far our rights go. And so for that, I want to introduce Isabel Fajardo. She's a lawyer, popular defender of human rights from the foundation Lazos de Dignidad, and she is part of the victim force of the state. She's specializing in human rights right now. Uh, Today we will have also Nadia Trivino, uh, juridical coordinator of the Foundation Lazos de Dignidad, a lawyer, defender of the public, and she's conducting magister. Okay. We also have Andres Camilo Rodriguez, philosopher from the movement Alternativa. He's a magister student, master's student in contemporaneous problems, 10 years experience in politics, and he's related to human rights. He's a writer, an opinion writer of different topics in different sceneries. And Mauricio Guerra, a politologist from Universidad Nacional of Colombia, a human rights researcher in the Redhus network, and, and a delegate for the Council of BOSA for the human rights sector, member of the popular coordinator of BOSA. Mauricio, Isabel, Andres, Nadia, we thank you very much for taking part of the second encounter of the right to city. Welcome, and I'll give you the opportunity so that we can start our conference of the right to defend. The right to a defense. Welcome. Thank you. Well, at the first moment, I introduce myself, Isabel Fajardo. I'm a lawyer, a popular defender of human rights. I will explain why popular defender of human rights, which is a characteristic, a little bit, a term that is a little bit that we used to introduce ourselves officially. And in this report, we have been grouping together, collecting. I was part of Redhus, the network, with some of the people who are here at this panel, the experience and the knowledge and the dynamics that I learned at Redhus and in the territorial spaces have been essential in this process of popular defense of human rights. At present, I'm working at Foundation Lazos of Dignidad. I'm a defender of human rights. That's a defender of human rights organization, um, which is dealing with the matter of social protest. And Alternativa is also another process, a young process, born, by the way, from the feeling of the people and from what's been going on in the city of Bogota. We have been for some time working jointly a little bit from the territories, side by side with those who have been, in colloquial terms, eating gas or being beaten, struck by the public forces, by the law enforcement, but we're still resistant and exercising our defense of human rights for the victims of police brutality, for the state victims, and for the people who are still resisting in the territories and who are still building from the territories that dignify life and a country in peace. We're very happy and we thank this opportunity that CPAD and Transeúntes Disidentes have allowed us today. And we're here to officially introduce, I say it with a lot of love, with a lot of hope, but especially on behalf of the victims of September 9th, 10th, and 11th in Bogota. Victims who were, and we have to say it, murdered at the hands of the police, of the national police. They were murdered uh, within the framework of a complying state, of an accomplice state. And 3 months later, they're still claiming for the truth, justice, and integral repair and the non repetition of these facts. This is a report that we have built with a lot of love, let me repeat, on behalf of these people, and especially on behalf of the defenders of human rights, the leaders, social leaders that from each territory are building a country. This is a report that fills us with love and that we expect will work as a tool to understand what social protest is, what police violence or brutality is, and at what moment it started, and something that worries us as defenders of human rights within the framework of the city is territorial control that has been exercised on the different territories, especially in the localities, the peripheral places of Bogota, where it's undeniable that there's the presence of paramilitary forces. It's undeniable that there is a direct relationship between those uh, paramilitary forces and agents of the state, more precisely the national police. So for us, it's really important to be able to present this report in these three lines that we call the right to defend. And it's the right to defend because we, the defenders of human rights, have been stigmatized. We have been murdered. We have been attacked for exercising the defense of human rights at the communities and in the relationship of state civilians. We are very vulnerable. So we decided to call it the right to defend, the right to a defense, to highlight the work on human rights that from people who are still working hard on this for a dignifying life for the people. I'll start quickly talking a little bit about the right to the protest, and I would like those who are connected right now to be able to access this web page so that this is a little bit dynamic. Um, you can access the following web page: www. I will write it on the chat. And I want everybody to access the chat. And I want you to write with your words what words you correlate with social protest. www. .mente. I'll repeat for those of us who are following on Facebook: www.menti.com, and 9528867 is the entrance code, the access code. And the code is 9528867. This virtual thing is sometimes complicated, so if any of those of you who are here in Zoom can confirm that you could access the webpage, I'd really appreciate it. I accessed it through the cell phone, and you could do it.
Sí.
Yes, I could do it. I could do it as well. Thank you so much. There are some words: democracy, social violence, justice. Yes. On the screen, it says, what words do you relate to social protest? Democracy, social violence, justice. Could you write your words?
Yo escribí tres.
I wrote three: repression, justice. Should we write all of them or just a few? As many as you can think of when we're talking about social protest. Democracy, repression, rights, inconformity, legitimacy, justice, fight, democracy, struggle. So here we can see them a little. Dignity, defense, guarantee, unity, tear gas, inconformity, peace, struggle, strength. Now we're re-signifying this. We're providing a new meaning for this, for social protest. And I wanted to start the conference with this exercise because undoubtedly social protest has become a mechanism of vindication of organization, social organizations transformations. And as you explained yourselves in this chart of words, are organized to claim for guarantees. Another one of the words that we could see on that chart: to claim for our guarantees within a rightful state as the one that we should be in. We need this for the compliance of our fundamental rights. History has told us that recognizing rights, acknowledging rights, all the different types of rights, essential rights, right to work, right to education. There are many other discussions, but undoubtedly, those were attained through struggle, through fighting by the citizens, the civilians. And this is related to other rights, the right to social protest. And it's important to point this out because in Colombia, this right has been violated, or vulnerated, vulnerated by institutions of the state and governmental institutions, and organizations which undoubtedly have been related to the state. But however, these struggles have allowed us to acknowledge the rights, but also to acknowledge a series of tools, elements, talking about Colombian rules and regulations and international rules and regulations. And I would like to talk a little bit about our current history and the guarantees we have towards the right to the protest. The first is the big national strike that was called in 2011 by students, in which public universities and private university students and even high school students were out on the streets claiming for guarantees for a dignified education and a quality education. We have to mention that these mobilizations, these marches, rallies were reprised, violently repressed. And another one of the terms that we used, tear gas, this was repressed through the use of tear gas. tear gas, sorry. Besides exercising the right to the protest, besides being violated with the right of protest being violated, a lot of the students and leaders later on were framed judicially. And this is another one of the patterns that we can identify in this report of how the right to protest is violated. The second element that it's very important for us to go over, because it proves a lot of elements for Bogota and the city, is the agricultural strike in 2013 that was also repressed, and the right to protest was violated. Even the right to a life was violated because some people were murdered by the anti-rioting organization of the police, and they were simply claiming guarantees for Colombian agriculture. So they went out to the streets and they were strongly repressed. And the third moment that I would like to point out, which is also very important for the guarantee of the right to protest and other rights, fundamentally the right to peace, is the final agreement for the ending of the conflict and the construction of peace between the extinct FARC guerrillas and the former President Juan Manuel Santos government. And this point three, sorry, this point two of the agreement provides us with some elements and tools for the defense and participation, political participation for the defense of guarantees of social mobilizations to completely practice our rights with full guarantees and adequate guarantees, our right to manifest and march, demonstrate. Based on this agreement, one of the resolutions that arose was uh, the defense of national human rights. Quickly, we have to understand that, as we have been saying before, talking about defense, dispute, fight, people on the street, organizations on the street, the social vindications, popular social vindications, um, a series of rights have been acknowledged recently, and they have been included in the different international and national instruments, international law, and the human rights, so that this right to the protest is acknowledged. Because many times we're on the streets uh, marching and demonstrating, and we believe that we are led to believe that the only right related to this is the right to gather, to unite and associate. However, with this report, we have also been gathering information as defenders of social human rights, sorry, because we're on the ground with the people in the most vulnerable places and where most violations occur. So we are constantly uh, standing side by side with the victims. And experience have told us also that it's not just the right to unite and assemble, there are also other rights that are intimately related to the right of, to protest. And with the different international instruments and the International Pact for Civil Rights and Political Rights and the Human Rights American Act and the American System of Human Rights and the Organization of United Nations have provided us with, have acknowledged the rights that the Colombian state has incorporated and acknowledged and included in our juridical ordinance or constitution. And the compliance with these rights hasn't always happened. We will illustrate this with some graphs that we will explain later. These rights have been violated, especially by the state. For example, the right to free expression, that's when we are out on the streets, the free circulation, free movement, fundamental right to freedom, and the right or the liberty to freely and autonomously conform political parties and movements, which undoubtedly strengthen social organizations. These elements are key to the transformation and to claim our rights on the streets from all the different groups that are part of this society. Let's say that this series of acknowledgement of rights, coupled with those three historical moments that we mentioned before, provide a series of tools and elements that we need to go over precisely because we need them. Because one would think that these are the tools that guarantee our rights to go out to the streets and exercise our rights fully and fearlessly. And it's the legitimate right to a social protest. However, as we have seen, and we've realized, as history has shown us, we have found that these rights have been violated, our human and fundamental rights have been violated, and they've been, and it's been important, it's been necessary, and it's been a requirement by social organizations and by the organizations that defend human rights to be able to vindicate and to be able to claim, to require from the state the guarantee to the right of protest, a full guarantee of that right. And apropos the national strike and the rally of the people from the country sector, the countryside sector, agricultural sector, and from the students, um, we have created one of the first protocols for social mobilizations. And it was created within the city of Bogota at the city hall with the former mayor Gustavo Petro. And this protocol is adjusted for mobilizations in Bogota to guarantee the right to protest and the right to march within the city. This exercise, or this right, this protocol is absolutely important, of the utmost importance for the human right defenders, but especially for those who have been rallying on the streets, who are exercising the right to protest. And it acknowledges the exercise of the verification commissions and their work in the territories. What are verification commissions? Who are they? Who are these people wearing uniforms? Who do they report to? Those wearing a jacket saying human rights, who do they report to? It is precisely these commissions that are there on the ground to promote dialogue and communications with the people who are legitimately marching and with the institutions. Let's see, they guarantee the right to protest. However, even though this protocol exists, during the administration of the mayor Enrique Peñalosa, this was never installed. He never set up a table, sorry, he never set up a work group to verify the compliance of this protocol. And in March 2020, this protocol is set up in pursuit of a different culture in the mayor city hall. But still, City Hall continues to delegitimize social protest and attacking the right to protest of those who defend human rights. And precisely one of the claims of human rights defenders, um, in light of ill-intentioned claims by the current administration, we are claiming for the recognition of this group, of this work group, to be able to guarantee the work that we have been doing as human rights defenders. So we respond to those who are marching and the requirement to comply with human rights, to respect people's human rights in the territories. And this is very important to check with numbers what has been happening in the city of Bogota. And what are the patterns that have been arising, that have been emerging in the city? If there's vulneration, if there's transgression of the right to protest, the final peace agreement, as I said before, is another one of the historic moments, and the instruments that has been created, not just to acknowledge the rights of the victims, of the group of victims within the framework of the armed conflict in Colombia over 50 years, but it also um, there is also the acknowledgement of the rights of the victims. One of these rights that they are claiming for recognition, for acknowledgement, is the right to be able to create social organizations to claim guarantees in political participation. So, the second point of this agreement provides some points to guarantee the right to protest. However, since in the past 4 years following the signature of the agreement, the execution of the agreement, these protocols have not been put to practice. And as a result, we have seen that there are more than 600 leaders, social leaders, and human rights defenders that have been murdered because there are no guarantees for the exercise of political activities or for the exercise of social organization. Because besides the murders of ex guerrilla fighters. So, despite the fact that we have this instrument, guarantees have not been effective and have not been provided to guarantee the full exercise of the right to protest and participation, political participation. And it is evidenced in this series of murders and serious violations of human rights. However, as a result, one of the most important background events is Resolution 1190 by the Ministry of Government. It creates a series of instruments and a protocol to guarantee the respect and the full guarantee of human rights in procedures, in procedures in a protest. However, despite the existence of this resolution and this protocol, we have seen in the streets that national police acts irregularly with the excessive force and strength, excessive power, sorry. Um, People are being attacked. Those who exercise the right to march and protest have been attacked, and they're directly attempting against the life and physical integrity of the people who are marching. Because, mind you, the law enforcement is not complying with the protocols that have been established at this instrument, but also in their internal instruments and regulations, and they're not complying with this. Uh, there was silence. Okay, because these protocols exist. Despite this, the right to protest has been systematically repressed and obstacled. And what we found September 8th, 9th, and 10th at the city of Bogota and Suacha were murders at the hand of police officers. Finally, the legal protection, the lawsuit that was filed at the Ministry of Justice, we need to talk about it because it's been acknowledged that okay, this court acknowledges that there has been systematic use, excessive use of power by the national police, especially the anti-riots group. It's a systematic violations of the fundamental human rights of the people who are moving, marching, and that's why it proposes the national government to create a protocol to guarantee not to limit the right to protest. And a series of work groups have been created with the national government in which people, the plaintiffs of this lawsuit, have taken the suggestions of the human rights organizations to guarantee their right to protest so that it guarantees other rights as well that will allow people to go out into the streets without fear and to require and to claim for the guarantee and acknowledgement of those rights. Um, we at this report, with this report, based on what we have done, on what has been happening in social mobilization, we have also found that we can divide into four the patterns that have emerged with the violation of the right to protest in Bogota in 2020. That despite the fact that we have been in a very complicated reality and because of the contagion of COVID-19 virus and because of the obligatory confinement or isolation that forced us to be in our homes for so many months, despite that, we could go over and review that the structural problems of society have been made worse. And we could go out into the streets despite the isolation, the confinement, the quarantine. We got the people to go out into the streets to demand their full guarantees. However, and with this context of the pandemics, we must say that in the city of Bogota, there were more than 600 marches and 60 sceneries of social protest, not necessarily rallying on the streets, but also in other type of sceneries or scenarios where the right to protest is exercised. So more than 600. So as compared to previous years, it's really huge number because despite being under the context of COVID-19, people still went out to the streets. And in light of this, with this context that we have been discussing, we found that there are, okay, sorry, that these patterns may be sorted or classified into four categories. These violations of human rights and the right to social protest. And they are first, stigmatization, illegal searches, and judicial framing of the people. Second, violation of protocols and excessive force, excessive power by the national police. Third is police violence in social protests and in spontaneous mobilizations and planned or programmed mobilizations. And finally, the aggression to human rights defenders and also independent journalists that document what has been happening. At this point, I want again to go back to this to this little chart, to this app that we're using, and I want you to check, review at the same link, www.menti.com. Um, let's access the same link. Let's use the same code. We're going to talk about what places, what sceneries for human rights violations are there and that you have witnessed. Okay, I'm going to leave you a few minutes for you to write that down. Can you please confirm those who have direct access to Zoom
Ya, ya lo
if you
hice.
can access it again? Yes, I could access it. Thank you so much. The slide says, how do these violations of human rights occur during the protests?
¿Y si están escribiendo las palabritas? Yo
Are
acá.
you writing your words? Yes, we're through. Yeah, I did write them, but I'm not sure if I wrote them in the answering space of the previous question because I cannot see them there. Oh, I believe that's
¿Cuál
true.
escribiste tú?
Which one did you write? Tanks, sticks, police sticks, stigmatization,
No.
persecution, but I do not see them.
Cargamos al-
Okay, I'll try again.
No, al parecer no.
Well, it seems that. Okay, try again.
¿Y cómo es tu nombre?
What's your name? Margarita.
Margarita. Si quieres, iniciamos
Margarita, if
contigo.
you will, we
La
can
idea
start
es
with
conocer
you.
un poco
Why don't you
qué
tell us a little
represión tú
bit
has sentido por la
how you have
situación
felt
o
this
vulnerabilidad que tú has
repression
tenido como
or the
protesta?
vulneration of human rights within the framework of the social protest? Well, let's say that in mobilizations and rallies, the biggest one that I've seen, which was November 21st last year, there were many cultural manifestations. Everybody was there, actually, since the grandpa and the little babies. We were very far from the groups that normally attend these rallies and demonstrations. And despite the fact that it was the audience, the public was there present, and that we were at peace and calm, it was inevitable that violence always outbursts with the people who are um, the people who get into the protest. I could see the policemen providing hoods for those people who were intruding the protest. They were allies of the police, and then they put on the hoods, and then they attack the police directly, so the police has an excuse to start mistreating everybody. So when we were there at the Plaza de Bolivar, Bolivar Marketplace, there were many people, and then they start attacking us with tearing gas, with rubber bullets, and then everybody was trying to flee from the scene. People fell off onto the floor, and other people stomped on them. It was chaotic. It doesn't matter how peaceful you want to march. It doesn't matter what you want to do. It doesn't matter how legitimately you're protesting. They always trying to put up violence to justify their their
¿Alguien más que
violent
quiera
actions
compartirnos su
by
experiencia?
ESMAD and the police.
No sé si
Does
están
anybody
como
else want to share their
Facebook
experience? I don't know
donde
if people
pueden
at
compartir
Facebook
las experiencias por escrito,
can you
si
probably
están como
write your
personas
experiences down,
en la plataforma.
or those of you who are here at the platform?
¿Nadie? ¿Solo estábamos
No
Margarita
one?
y yo?
It's only Margarita and me? No one. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Well, I have also participated in several marches as well. I study at Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. I'm a student, and when we march, or when sometimes they don't even let us march, they won't even let us march. Simply, they have already been notified that we're going to start a protest, so they get there and they start using the tearing gas. And of course, they don't let us out. And the university is very small. So sometimes we've had chaotic situations because it's a very reduced space. So when they throw the tearing gas, you have no way out and you feel terrible. So it becomes chaotic. That's what happens within the university. But when we sometimes go out and march on the streets, it's a little bit similar to what Margarita mentioned before. Sometimes they uh, continue with the Batucada group, and some people propose sorry, peaceful marches and manifestations, but there's generally always a point on which the police, armed forces, the represses the march violently. Generally, when we are marching outside, there's a human rights group that marches with us side by side, but sometimes it's not enough because when the policemen enter to stop the march and break it, they literally do that. They break it, they stop it, and whoever stays there is arrested or seized. Well, there are many situations that I've had to witness around social protests. And it's also a mechanism of intimidation because there are many of my classmates who have been marching in other occasions and they are very motivated, but then when they see those circumstances happen, they don't want to march again. And people are reluctant to get out because a lot of people get out of the university early when there is a march called because they don't want to be present and they're afraid because of what has happened before in the previous marches. And this is an experience from the perspective of public universities. This is how they repress us, how they silence us and attack us and attack the whole process, the national police, and sometimes intruders or trespassers from other institutions. And they have access to the university um, to frame the students of the university. And what they seek is for people to believe that students use hoods um, to produce chaos, and they want to confront the public opinion with the students. They want to oppose, misjudge the students. They want the public opinion to misjudge the students. So we have been protesting to express that we don't agree with this. What's your name? My name is Magdalena. Thank you so much, Magdalena. Does anybody else want to
Sí,
participate?
yo quisiera,
Yes,
pues,
I would like
contarles que
to
yo
tell you
iba
that I was
en las
very
marchas
active in the rallies
y después
and that
viví muy cerca el
I had
caso
to live up close the
de,
case of
de Nicolás Neira,
Nicolas
que fue
Neira.
asesinado a golpes por la
He
policía.
was murdered, brutalized by the police,
He acompañado
beaten to
pues la
death,
lucha de Judy y su padre
and I have been side by side with
y
the
ese día,
Judy's fight and her father's
primero de
fight.
mayo,
That May
ocurrió
1st,
lo de
when this
Nicolás
happened, when
y eso
Nicholas's
cambió
murder
mucho para
happened,
nosotros en Biobío,
something changed for us. For many of us, something
la
changed.
percepción de seguridad para
The
salir a
perception
protestar
of security or
cambió
safety when you
y nos
protest
sentimos
changed.
más
And now we
con
feel
miedo,
more
¿no? Cuando
afraid,
uno
fearful,
ve, yo estuve
because when you
trabajando también en
see
una
that
época
I was also
eh,
working for some time
en el
with
Tratado de Minas
the
y
mining
esas
treaty
zonas y me sorprendió
of,
cómo
sorry,
de la misma
treaty of mines and improvised weapons, and it surprised me that the Colombian armed forces use improvised weapons like bullets filled with um, nails and screws and lots of elements that are found in the corpses of the people who have been murdered and students who have been murdered in social protests by the police. So I was very scared. And since my son was born, then I felt that nothing justified the fact that I could risk my life or risk myself because there's a child at home that needs me. So I decided to never march or protest again. And that's horrible because I know that, like me, there are many people who are undergoing the same thing. So we wrote some report of the situation, speaking to a lot of people like me who stopped protesting for one reason or another. Some of them because they're afraid, some of them because they don't have time because of work, and because there are many mothers who have little children at home. So you have no time but for your children. It's not enough for you to. You feel very guilty if you're a mother of a small child and you go out to the streets and march. So we wrote 10 basic rules for people to understand social protest um, without without complaining about it, but understanding that we can support the protest by not attacking the protest, not demeaning the protest, and not to say that it's a problem for transit and mobility and traffic in the city, but just to understand that we are fighting for your rights. You, onlooker, we are fighting for your rights, for the rights of everybody. So if you cannot come here and march with us, at least do not stigmatize those who are exercising their right of social protest. And in creating those 10 rules, those 10 means, um, it was discussed with many people as we were distributing it, but people used to answer, protesting is not a right. And that's how I realized that there's so much work to be done in raising awareness because what the media has been doing, at least in Colombia, against protest is the stigmatization that it's the left wing uh, fanatics or those who wear hoods and that they only seek to destroy. And so this perception of civilians and social protests have changed very much. So if from my experience, from my afraid experience, my fearful experience, now I'm very fearful, I'm very afraid to act against the police and to their arbitrary arrests and then their framings, their judiciary framings. I'm very afraid of that. So I believe that every time we're told that people do not protest, see in Ecuador, they could knock down a president and they fill the streets. And in Colombia, it doesn't happen. But it doesn't have, and I always answer it, yeah, in Colombia, it doesn't happen, but because we're murdered if we do it. And if we're not murdered the day of the protest, then we are murdered 4 days later, or we are framed and imprisoned. And that is the real dimension of social protest in Colombia. I don't know what it's like in other Latin American countries. It would be really good to be able to know that, but that's what happens with protest in Colombia. Thank you so much, Sylvie. Quickly, I will read, and I have just had access to the Facebook platform. Jade Rios is saying, organization from the south of the city on November 21st last year. In the absence of transportation at night, we made some community cooking. We did some community cooking for people who were walking on Autopista Sur. The police death squad got us out of there with the excuse that it was a critical point. Somehow we have been signaled singled out in these patterns. Just like Sylvia said, people are afraid to go out to the streets because definitely when people go out to the streets, they are murdered or they are framed and they start judicial processes against them. And those judicial framings and processes attempt against people's freedom and they deprive them of their rights. And these framings end up in arrests. And then we realize that, in fact, there were many judicial framings. And the people, okay, for example, in the Andino Mall bombings, something like this happened. In fact, there was no evidence, no material evidence to correlate the suspects with armed groups outside of the law. So we have all these elements, especially the pattern of police violence in the exercise of the right to social protest. And they lead us to understand that, in fact, the right to protest is being violated, and the right to protest continues to be treated or responded to with war, and it's still being stigmatized and criminalized. In light of everything that our speakers, that our fellow speakers have been saying in in the past few conferences. The first is stigmatization, yes, illegal searches and judicial framings. And last year, a few days after November 21st, and in the previous days, the days prior to the protests, we're going to celebrate this on November. We celebrate on November 21st. And we found that there were lots of illegal searches for the participants of social organizations and popular organizations defending human rights. That is to say, precisely they were the ones who were convoking mobilizations and rallies, and they were framed judicially, and some of them, many of them, are still arrested, deprived of their freedom, and amidst trials that get stuck and do not progress, and judicial processes that, as Sylvia mentioned, there is no evidence to prove that in fact there is a relation between the police and the armed groups outside of the law. So based on this, we're still being stigmatized, and the exercise of the right of social protest is still stigmatized. And this stigmatization goes beyond. And so we're going to start judicial processes against the people with no evidence to repress the right to protest. And I repeat, social protest, social mobilization has allowed us these vindications to society. So this stigmatization exercise is conducted by those intruders who trespass the marches, and they are the ones who belong to armed groups outside of the law. And these organizations are convoked or organized by these groups, and we're going to start judicial processes because we need to abide by the law. So this stigmatization is reflected in the protest social sceneries, and these illegal searches and these judicial framings have been constant in the exercise of social protests in different sectors and in the different territories. Okay, the second, talking about the elements that our previous speakers mentioned, is the violation of protocols and excessive use of power by the national police. So the state says, the government says, we have we can legitimately use power or gun power because it's within our faculties. And if we see that somebody is altering the order or attacking the rights of other people that are not being mobilized or are not marching, then we have to repress the march. So basically, they use they make a legitimate use, in quotes, of the power. That's the justification that police presents whenever they use excessive power. So, as defenders of human rights, we have realized that despite these instruments and protocols exist, the one from 2015, the resolution from 2018, the peace agreement with FARC, and the lawsuit that was filed in September this year guaranteeing the right to protest and provide a series of guarantees for this right. However, the national police still violating the protocols and interfering in the protests and not according to the protocols, to the provisions of the protocols, they directly repress the movement, the march, the demonstration. And this is what we have found during the exercise of this repression by the national police, especially the anti-rioting squad, more than 34 murders that are attributed to this squad in the exercise of their functions. Silvia already mentioned one of them. Nicolas Neira mentioned the case of Nicolas Neira, a 15-year-old boy who was murdered in a social protest. Dylan Cruz a year ago. And this pattern leads us to the third pattern that we have identified in this report, which is police violence within the framework of social protest. We have a series of protocols that, let me repeat, they have indicated the people and they have claimed for guarantees for the exercise of the full right to protest. And there are other guarantees, but the national police has not allowed the development of these protocols. And with these violations, this police violence is probably the most significant pattern in the vulneration of the right to social protests, especially at 2020 for the city of Bogota. As we said before, despite the fact that we have been isolated and confined because of the pandemics, people went out to the streets and rallied, and that's what we always saw. But then the human rights defenders that are working in the territories, here I have one of them that can bear witness to this, Mauricio. People in the locality of Ciudad Bolivar, Bosa, and Kennedy were marching in these first sceneries, starting the pandemics, and then they were repressed by the police. And this was a permanent aspect. In Ciudad Bolivar, we found that at the beginning of these pandemics, in Ciudad Bolivar, people were claiming for guarantees to be able to live through the confinement and quarantine. And then we discovered that there was a chopper flying over the locality, over the town, and in some areas where they have barely access to public lighting, so they could not see what was going on the hills. Then the police from that helicopter started launching tearing gas against the population, and many of the people who were victimized at this exercise were children and senior citizens. And there was a non-acknowledgement of these protocols of the use of power, and there was police brutality. And in this scenery of police violence, we can see what happened on September 9th, 10th, and 11th. Apropos the murder of Javier Ordóñez, a lawyer, 2 years old, and the early morning, Javier, and I mean, despite his autopsy, it was stated in his autopsy that there was excessive use of force and power by the National Police, and this was the first murder that was evidenced on September 9th in the city of Bogota. Okay, the speaker's camera stopped.
Te perdimos.
We lost you, Isabel. We lost you.
Creo que es con un problema de su conexión.
I think it's a connection problem. Yeah, same thing happened to me a while ago. The connection's been bad.
Bueno, pues mientras Isabel
Well,
regresa
while
con
Isabel
nosotros,
returns,
no sé si
I don't know
Mauricio
if
quiera
Mauricio wants
participar
to follow up
en la charla.
and move on with his conference.
Hola,
Hi, good afternoon. How's everyone? Give me please a minute while I organize my
Mauricio, yo creo que
screen.
algo pasó con Isabel
Yeah,
porque
we'll wait for you. I'm sure that
pues
something happened with Isabel's connection because she is completely
¿qué
disconnected. Now we're
pasa?
not seeing her screen anymore. Well,
Entonces,
things like this happen
totalmente
at these
prácticamente
virtual encounters. We are fully depending
ahí
on
está
technology.
Isabel.
Okay, Isabel is back.
Sí,
If you want, we can wait for
entonces
Isabel to
estábamos
end.
hablando mientras ella volvía.
Yes, yes, we were only going to start speaking before she came back, but now that she's back, hi. Sorry, my internet connection
No te preocupes.
was bad. Don't worry, we understand.
Y justo estaban golpeando, pero bueno,
And
estaba con que en el marco pues
so,
de esto, nosotros encontramos
within this context, we found that the
este
first
cargo de
murder
hora tuvo
took
lugar a
place
las 9 de la noche,
at
¿sí?
9
Sobre las
p.m.
9 de la noche.
Around 9 p.m.
Germán Puentes Valero, un joven de
Germán Puentes
25
Valero,
años,
a
fue
25-year-old
asesinado
boy,
por
was
la policía
murdered
de la
by the
Nacional
national police.
que no estaban siguiendo protocolos,
And
¿sí?
they were not following the
Estos hombres
protocols.
estaban haciendo uso de
And they were
armas
using
prohibidas
weapons
en el
which
marco
are
del
forbidden in
escenario
the
nacional.
context of social
Y este escenario
protest.
que pasa en Suba
And the
se replicó
scenery
en
which
Bernal,
happened in
en
Suba was
Bolívar,
replicated in
Bolívar
Bernal, in
en
Ciudad
Santoso,
Bolívar, in Bosa,
en San Cristóbal
in San
y Suacha.
Cristobal, and Suacha.
Suacha, 3 asesinatos.
Three
En
people
Bogotá
murdered in
hubo 5
Suacha,
asesinatos.
on
Después de esos
11 people
asesinatos,
murdered in Bogota,
10 Javier,
12 if we count
personas
Javier's murder
que
in,
estaban ejerciendo el
people who were
derecho,
exercising
el
their
legítimo
legitimate
protesto,
right and constitutional right to
asesinatos
protest, and
a
murders
jóvenes
of
menores de edad, sobre todo
people who were
jóvenes
underage,
asesinatos
youngsters underage,
estaban llegando
and
pues
people who
a
were
sus hogares,
just
¿no?
marching
Estos
back to their homes.
asesinatos hay que decir
So,
que
from these murders, we
coincidencialmente
can
en varios de ellos
say
no hubo
that
un avance
3 months
real
later,
en el marco
in many of
penitenciario,
them, there has been no
precisamente
progress in
porque
the criminal
no es una
investigations
entrega
because
oportuna
there
de
is
los
no
denunciantes o los
timely
hospitales no han
submittal of the
hecho
autopsy results, or the hospitals do not
adecuadamente
render very adequate
de la muerte,
reports
las
on the
causas de la
causes of
muerte, es
death
decir,
or around
hay
the
un
time of
ejercicio
times of death.
necesario que no ha permitido pues
So there is a
avanzar
scenery
frente
that has not
o de manera penal
allowed this to
frente a la
progress
responsabilidad
judicially,
individual de las personas que
uh,
individual y demando
referring to the
personas
individual
que no están
responsibilities
haciendo
of
uso,
the
no están
police
cumpliendo con
officers
los
who
protocolos y que
were not following the
recurren a
protocols
violencia
and who resorted to
estos ejercen
violence.
violencia policial que pues
And this
desgraciadamente
constituted the police
termina en hechos
violence
de masacre en la ciudad de Bogotá
that
y en la ciudad
basically created a massacre, did a massacre in the city of Bogota
a Bogotá.
and in Suacha,
Frente a estos procesos hay que
in the
decir
nearby
que
municipality of Suacha. So
las
about the
investigaciones
sceneries, what we have to say is that criminal investigations have not made progress and the disciplinary investigations have not
han
advanced
existido también muchos
because there
nuevos
has
avances,
been
lo que
a
decíamos,
lot of
que en el
interventions
marco
and
de
obstacles
negociaciones,
by the
en el
police,
marco pues
and their excuses
del
that
poder
this is happening
consolidado de
within the
la
framework of
policía,
their
pues esta
functions and the
posibilidad tampoco
responsibilities.
hay y que pues
Um,
no hay una responsabilidad
so there is no
ciudadana
responsibility
de la fuerza, ¿sí? Y otro
towards this
elemento
excessive
también
use of
en
power.
este espacio
And
es que
other elements that
casos
concern
como el
us
caso de Dylan Cruz
is, for example, such as in the case of Dylan
es
Cruz,
caso penal militar,
is that they will not be treated by criminal justice, but by military justice. And this concerns the victims and us as defenders of human rights and as lawyers, as representators of victims, representatives of victims. In their own words, this is competence of the military justice, and we're concerned about this because the military justice uh, does not care for the victims and does not satisfy the needs of the victims. And this is, I believe, the most evident pattern in the violation of the right to protest. Just like the speakers, my fellow speakers said before, police brutality is a constant guideline in, in the framework of social protest. So our role is to claim for the guarantees, full guarantees of the right to protest. We must we must demand a structural reform of the national police structure, and they should not respond to the military justice but to the criminal justice. And this restructuring should eliminate, in fact, this anti-rioting squad, and it should create a peace squad so that they can provide guarantees for the people's right to a social protest. And finally, in this report, we found out that the violations of the rights of defenders of human rights has also been constant. It's been permanent. And because in the review that we did on January 21st, we found that some of the verification commission's participants were attacked in the protest of Universidad Nacional of Colombia and the locality of Kennedy, but they just as well they don't allow us to verify, despite the fact that these protocols allow us to, and we are acknowledged by those protocols as an actor. But they have not allowed us to verify this and to perform the checking and that cross reference. And when we do it, then we're attacked when we try to do it. And several human rights defenders and two human rights defenders from Fundación Lazos de Dignidad, we were attacked by the national police. When we showed our ID on our jackets, saying that we were doing institutional work and verifying the terrain, they shot us directly to our bodies when this is strictly forbidden by the protocol. Okay, the protocol say that the gunshot should be up to the air and not directly to our bodies. Thank God, because of that attack, the attack that I was subjected to had no more serious consequences. But regarding my institution mate, my coworker, she had a bullet in between her eyes, some millimeters close to her eyebrow, and she was very close to losing her eye. This is another one of the patterns that we have seen that have been stated and rooted. We find that there is no guarantee to the right to protest. There is not a scenery that will provide us those tools to guarantee the right to protest, which I repeat, encompasses a series of rights that are acknowledged in International Rights Act and in the juridical ordinance, Colombia, and they have happened as a result of social vindications that people have done with mobilizations and rallies. And this is the end of my conference. Thank you so much. Um, I will present my report to you. It's a tool that we want to distribute broadly. We want it to be an element to understand that in the city, within the city, we can also claim for the right to the city and the right to inhabit our territories and dwell our territories. But we also demand that police brutality stops and that in social protest, we demand that we are provided our guarantees. And we're also claiming for the protection of the right for those who protest and to repair the victims. Thank you so much again, Transeúntes, for allowing us to present this report. And Mauricio, you may continue. Let me repeat to you that for us, the defense of human rights from the exercise of popular defense of human rights is a tool too that we have used for the transformation of the ugly truth that people live within the territories. Thank you very much. This is the official launch of this report. It's been built with a lot of love by these three institutions that are seeking transformation, that we seek to protect life and we seek to protect peace in our territories. Thank you so much. And Mauricio, you may continue
Ok,
with
listo.
the
Gracias.
next section of our
Vamos con
report.
los
Thank you
cuestionarios.
so much, Isabel. Very
Seguimos
interesting.
adelante y me imagino que
And
luego
let's move
vamos a entrar
on,
como en una etapa de preguntas y
and
soluciones.
then we will
Ahora te doy
go
la
back to
palabra.
you for questions and answers. For now, Mauricio, you have the floor. Hi, good afternoon. A very special hello to Transeúntes Disidentes, all the people that are following us through Facebook Live and through this space, and of course, the territories of South Bogota, Southern Bogota, where we have worked um, with, we have been working with youngsters and with the way people inhabit the neighborhoods. We would like to start with a type of background so that we can understand where we stand to start writing this report, where we stood when we started writing this report. First, what happens in the city of Bogota, the capital city of the country? Well, to understand this, it's necessary to date back to an important element, which is what is the characteristic of this country? Characteristic that deals with the conflict, the social conflict, and armed conflict that we've had directly in the rural areas and indirectly in the city. And this has happened for over 50 years. What we are seeing now at the city is that this is currently related with the impact of the conflict. And not acknowledging this would be violently disacknowledging, unacknowledging, sorry, the problem of the peripheral areas and the neighborhoods, and to attribute those problems to other elements that are not realistic and impacting the victim. The conflict still affects the victim and affects those in need, the millions of poor people that inhabit this country. In that sense, Bogota has become that place where all of these populations converge. And we're talking about foreign migration, we're talking about conflict victims, and now those reincorporated, the ex-combatant reincorporated from FARC and from the paramilitary forces. So they add to the scenery, and this presents a problem, an additional problem to those that the city already has. And this makes the situation a lot more complex. This doesn't mean that their inclusion of these groups is a problem. No, on the contrary, this is an element that we can use to analyze what has been happening in the city of Bogota and in the big capitals, the other capitals of our country. That's the first element. And to acknowledge that the conflict affects the city and that we are not far from what's happening in the countryside. Then in this city, we can trace all the illegality of the markets created by this war and that we would like to stop. This is where we stand. So the second aspect, what happened if we were supposed to have a peace agreement? Well, between 2016 and 2020, we started a series of discussions again in the country. The first is that we're not discussing war again in the political reality of the country, but the implementation of the peace agreement and the group of problems that were made invisible because of this war. So within the scenery of the war, what was important was the casualties by one actor or the other in the war, and not the rural and social problem that this war, this conflict was creating. Now they're starting to be visible with the social manifestations and rallies and all the violations of human rights that occur in the country that before were practically invisible and they were not analyzed by the media. That's the following, and that's the next element. Under this perspective that we have in the city of Bogota, between 2016 and 2020, Bogota became the epicenter of mobilizations, rallies in the country. I'm talking about the biggest, the most massive ones in 2016, the peace agreement rally, and 2017 and 18, the elections, presidential elections, and on 2000, in 2019, the national strike, the big mobilization rally of the national strike, and of course, other protests or rallies that, as well as they may be carried out from the regions, they incite and have direct incidents, sorry, on the city of Bogota. So Bogota is the epicenter of this, and it will always depend on how the mobilization is done in the city of Bogota. That is the second aspect. That convergence of populations plus the increase of their motivations derived in the fact that when Ivan Duque got to the presidency, this was another negotiation factor that the national government had. With Santos government, we had the anti-rioting squad, and there was the presence of armed groups in the city of Bogota. But the incidence was not as direct as it is now, as they conform the marchers and people who rally today. Within the logic of war, we have the threats for general populations after they have protested or mobilized. And later on, we have the first murders, and of course, the extrajudicial executions, and also the, the extrajudicial executions, falsos positivos, judicial framings. So, what Isabel mentioned before as patterns for prosecution of human rights is systematic, and it's a modus operandi. That's how they exercise control over civilians in the city. That's the global context. Now, what is happening with the armed groups? Because we used to say that in Bogota, with the early alert 023 in the year 2019, we have been to demobilize armed groups from the paramilitary forces. They demobilized in 2005 and 2007, but after that, there was a process of the process which is called Ley de Justicia y Paz, Peace and Justice Law, and they were taken to different prisons around the country, and in exchange for telling the truth, they will be guaranteed their freedom to leave prison in the following years. Many of them exited prison, were released, but a country that proposes a peace agreement without a real guarantee to reincorporate the people to society, well, they will, of course, reincide in war, and they will reincide under new logics. Because we're not talking about the paramilitary forces that we had in 2005. We're talking about armed groups that are reconfigured and with greater strength, they're taking on the scenery of mobilization. And in, for example, this made the problem of the land more serious in Colombia. There was a dispute between proprietors, landowners, and armed groups. And they were made invisible, but they still exercised some sort of control on the territories, like los rastrojos, los urabeños, and now we have new armed like El Clan del Golfo, of course, the dissident FARC guerrilla combatants. So now these are all added to the previously existing armed groups outside of the law that we had, like ELN and FARC. So now we have a jigsaw of problems and armed groups, each one of them with their own vindications. But what's clear is that these groups pose conflict, that these groups were configured after the peace agreement with FARC and with the paramilitary forces were signed and executed. And now they continue with the same mechanisms, fear mongering and terror. And when we talk about these logics of terror, we mean maiming the people, maiming the corpses, threats, pamphlets, threatening pamphlets, favoring especially the Colombian armed forces and political sectors from the far right. We were also dealing with the configuration of new neo-Nazis groups in Bogota, and now they will get directly to the capital of the city, and there will, because of this, there will be the necessity to talk about the problem of drugs in Colombia. So I wanted to talk about this to uh, set the framework for the next part of the speech. Now we're found with a new process that we would not like to repeat, which is the appearance of these pandemics. And it changed everything about us, and it changed our way to relate to nature and to society. And this led us to take some really strong decisions and to choose between public health and basic rights, fundamental rights like a right to a household and education. Why do I mention this? Because the city of Bogota, being a place where different actors converge, social actors, then we will also have problems between those who have more buying power, more economic power and money, and those who don't. In only three localities of the city, the 70% of the population of the city is concentrated, and the rest of it are localities that are practically virtually empty. And this is a problem, the spatial problem in the city, and it will continue to grow in southern Bogota, especially localities of Bosa, Kennedy, and Ciudad Bolivar. The big number of people that have to be displaced to the center of the city or to the center of the country. And of course, as when since pandemics is happening in these localities, their problems are now bigger. So what happened? Before quarantine, we had a constant scenery of mobilization, marching, more or less two per week. And those protests, those mobilizations, okay, were coupled with all the effects from the national strike. And this was providing a certain social engine for the city of Bogota. What happened with this? Well, there was a need to place in the middle what was happening with the situation of human rights. In the national strike, there was a strong repression, but the reality is that the strongest repression happened with police patrols and not the anti-rioting squad. This does not reduce the anti-rioting squad damage the damage that they have done. But we had different actors. It was the patrolling policemen who were doing all sorts of activities and maneuvers in pursuit of violation of the right to protest. And this made this first cycle very difficult with institutionality. Those first 3 months of the year did not repose a bigger problem around the human rights situation. However, what happened is that in Kennedy and Bosa, the murders escalated and increased, mainly in the southern and western Bosa, and I can't remember the name of that place right now, Corabastos and Kennedy. Okay, so what were the consequences of this? So there were many problems presenting on the sceneries. Just in Ciudad Bolivar, where social protests were in the rise, then there were two repressions by the police that directly repercuted in dynamics of terror in the neighborhood, especially on the third mountain, Los Luceros, and the second mountain, the sector of Paraíso. During the first 3 months of this year, there were two threats in Ciudad Bolivar, not directly signed by armed groups, but they were threats that posed problems for the people. Now, once the quarantine or isolation started, what happened was that it completely changed the dynamics of the armed groups and the social organizations, and the community in general. In the month of April, the three localities represented very few murder cases, um, which is the pattern of prosecution. And in May, we had the first executions. Bosa, only 8 days after starting quarantine, could witness a very serious case of police brutality, with the aggravating aspect that there was sexual abuse in the police station of Villa del Rio. So, what elements do we find here? That institutionality plus armed actors configure then the map of human rights violations in the city of Bogota. Now, how are we going to deal with the patterns of prosecution? Well, first one is territorial control as a fundament for violation of human rights. To understand this territorial control, we're going to have to talk about the concept of, okay, it is assumed that territorial control is in the dynamics of control, of dispute, and its maximum expression of systematic violence that may constitute aggressions towards civilians and communities. This is a concept by Giraldo, and this is the concept where we stand on right now, the territorial context. Okay, it's an accumulation of conflicts that poses a possibility for violence. So, what happens at the three localities? At the locality of Bosa, territorial control is mainly located on the frontiers of the neighboring municipality of Suacha and the southern part with San Jose. This has been in 2018 and 2019. There was police brutality and authority abuse and several murders in these areas. This was constituted. Okay, this area was declared a drug trafficking area, and they used that as an excuse to violate rights of the people. There were very strong problems with the population and the armed groups. At the end of 2018, two of these groups are still working. There have been threats from the paramilitary forces, and especially from the bloc Águilas Negras, Black Eagles, and in Kennedy, there have been threats, especially threats, attempts against lives of social defenders, social leaders, and especially this economic epicenter, which is Abastos, where there is María Paz, El Amparo. All of these areas have another problematic focus around the 13th Avenue and Central Kennedy, and in Ciudad Bolivar. Despite the fact that it's a bit more homogeneous, there is the confrontation of big groups around Paraíso, one of the most problematic neighborhoods with the highest population growth, and its access is very complicated, and many other different dispute zones, especially Flores Santo Domingo and Santa Viviana, very close to Soacha. This does not mean that Soacha is to blame, and this is all Soacha's problem. No, on the contrary, Soacha, simply for being an urban municipality in contact with the city of Bogota, is constituted as a problematic focus. And that's why the situations of human rights violations occur, and they can be more serious, since this implies that the central city okay, adds up to the violence occurring in the nearby municipalities, and this increases the poverty of the people. Okay, allow me a moment, please. The violation to human rights, or the second factor, citizen coexistence. As I said before, in the three localities, there are certain police stations that became problematic for the exercise of social protest, especially for the young ones. We're talking about Bosa, the Villa del Rio police station, Viamonte, and Porvenir. Also Brasilia police station, with a few cases. In Kennedy mainly, the police station Tintal and Patio Bonito, and Caldas. And in Ciudad Bolivar, you have the police station San Francisco. That's one of the most problematic ones. And in the last few months, we have been hearing about Perdomo police station, which is a little bit more isolated from those neighborhoods, since it's in a area of former factories, old factories in southern Bogota. But likewise, what we have found in the violations that occur at the police stations is that there is not a direct revision or review of the cases. Um, Bad procedures, violation of the protocols, physical abuse, and I'm talking about beatings for the youngs or for the protesters. And we're also talking about sex abuse, sexual abuse. Um, Women have been raped and they have been undressed. They have undressed men as well, and denigration because of sexual orientation. This is what we have evidenced under this outlook. But there is also a slowing down of public policy addressed to the compliance of human rights. What happens there? Well, as long as there are many protocols protecting human rights, there's a short circuit between the police in the district and the district, despite the fact that, and we acknowledge the fact that they've tried to start a process around the human rights protocols and the police code. The reality is that this process has been very slow, especially over the last 5 years. We could almost say that during the government, Peñalos's government, nothing happened with this. And that's the problem we had. But also the solution delivered by the police every time there is a authority abuse case or brutality case is the increase of power. If there is a strong problem in a neighborhood and then police power is increased as well, then this will directly incide in the problem. Then in the end, okay, this will be transitory because they will not remain for a long time, or it will become a greater violence problem against the population. This is the multiple factor of the coercive measures for people and in poor neighborhoods. Here. Yeah, I'm using my cell phone, so it's a little bit harder for me to view the documents. Okay. What are the tendencies or trends of this factor of violence, this violence pattern within the context of these demobilized paramilitary forces? Well, murders, murders in the dispute territories with main trends towards the murder of men, 72% of the cases of murder, and the remaining 28% towards women with no accountability and no accountability. Also, there is a food crisis, especially in Bosa, and Ciudad Bolivar, which in this quarantine had a greater mobilizations. And this was concentrated especially in Bosa Central, southern Bogota, and Perdomo. There were mobilizations. Curiously, Tintal Sur and Meseta Central, okay, are the ones who have become the main epicenters of violence. Within the framework of the quarantine, within Bosa, Bosa has been the locality that where most complicated situations have occurred. Likewise, um, Corabastos and Amparo have had greater security problems, and lives have been attempted against. While in other localities like Suba, it has decreased. And that's what we have found. So, what's the focus, the main focus, the epicenter of these violent events and these murders, or in the neighborhoods, the peripheral neighborhoods, and the frontiering neighborhoods, where there is a lot of affluence of commerce and where the economic dynamics favor this conflict without them being detected by the institutions. Likewise, okay, I'm going to talk with my camera off because I dropped my cell phone. Well, just likewise, in Ciudad Bolivar and Bosa, there was a crisis of health assistance. And in around 100 neighborhoods had no health services. There is an Aboriginal community in Bosa, and they were greatly affected. They got no assistance, no help from the institutions. And they only get help after they had many deaths for COVID, from COVID. As for the impact on criminality, and the places where crimes are mostly committed, most often committed, are Kennedy and Bosa, mainly people who have no families, mainly outside of the families, or especially in August, and such as, for example, theft and bicycle theft, also public transportation mugging within the massive transportation stations of Transmilenio. Also, okay, because there are fewer buses in the massive transportation system in Bogota. High impact crimes have had a strong relationship with the safety front. Remember that since President Duque rise to power, he has governed much in the style of Álvaro Uribe. And the security fronts that have been created have basically been created or fundamentally created by members of the civilian society, but who are in relation with violence towards communities. For example, in Bosa, we have a security front in Zona Rosa, and this makes the situation more complex. But just like that, there has been a rearming of groups and societies to attempt against populations that are more vulnerable, like, for example, Venezuelans that have been victimized with physical aggressions, with more or less 15%, 15% of the victims in the city of Bogota, which is terrible for a capital city. And of course, the security fronts connected with illegal groups and the institutions. And this security front have occurred and have been created to keep territorial control within the neighborhoods. This has also been a strong problem that has been reported, outspoken, with attempt, okay, for migrating for migrants and the homeless, especially in the locality of Kennedy, and interconnected with those security fronts. Kennedy and Ciudad Bolivar, for example, none of these cases um, of violence against these communities have been attended or been responded. And there is a growth of the criminal groups that cross the borders from one municipality to the other. What I say by crossing the border is that what I mean is that they're not just working in one locality, but in many at the same time, and they kill more and more, and they have a bigger structure each time. So, what is our response towards this? Well, since a work life, a dignified work life is not guaranteed, then criminality, of course, will be increased, but also labor in criminality. Okay, so this works for illegality to grow. Right now, the people who are inside armed groups in localities are not necessarily nationals, but migrants, not only Venezuelans, but also Colombians from other regions of the country. But this is something that we have to strongly emphasize. In Colombia, armed groups outside of the law are not created by foreigners, but by Colombians, because the actors are the state and the illegal armed groups that we already know, insurgents and paramilitary forces. This is important to keep in mind. These are Colombians hiring a cheaper labor hand, and then with this problem of the Venezuelan migrants, they are susceptible to falling under these networks. So the question is, what measures have the district taken to prevent this from happening, to prevent civilians and migrants to fall in these networks? We must also mention that urban tribes, and since women have had a greater violence in communities, for example, in the last 4 months, there's been an increase of kidnappings and forced disappearances of women, which is thought to aim at the reconfiguration of these illegal networks of um, human trafficking. And also for human organs theft. We had not detected it before, and as much as it has not been dealt with by the media or in the news, it is happening. We cannot discard it because it has happened to a lot of people in the city of Bogota. Their organs have been illegally extracted, and could be victims of armed groups or sexual exploitations. In the city of Bogota, in the southern parts, people people have been reported to be kidnapped and sexually exploited. Finally, the threat factor and attacks on the population by paramilitary forces on communities, um, it increased during quarantine, during the pandemics, and this was carried out by the blog Águilas Negras Black Eagles. Mm. One of the threats had no author. We believe that probably this pamphlet was from a security front. We're not 100% sure, but most of them are written by Black Eagles, Águilas Negras. And those pamphlets circulated at the same time in different localities and neighborhoods. For example, during a night in Bosa and Ciudad Bolivar, the same pamphlet circulated, and then 8 days later, in Bosa, there was a new pamphlet, but with the signalings and claims and framings that they did in Suacha, and especially linking people who belong to social movements and political parties like Colombia Humana, and of course, guerrilla ex-combatants. and they have been threatened as well. The places where these threats have occurred the most are Amparo, southern Bogota, Bosa, Santo Domingo. Likewise, the neighboring municipality of Suacha, the municipality of La Despensa, that shares borders with Bogota. In Ciudad Bolivar, threats have been registered threatening with social cleansing and threats against social leaders, including with public representatives, like, for example, the local administrative board. There have been constant threats in these areas. Also for social leaders in Divino Niño and many other areas, taking into consideration that in Divino Niño, uh, there was a huge mobilization during pandemics. One of them in Campamento. Okay, later on, the people who organized it were threatened. Ciudad Bolivar is considered the locality with the greater attacks against social leaders, the greatest number, highest number. However, Bosa is where more threats by pamphlets occur. These features happen because Ciudad Bolivar has more mobilization, and Bosa has more threats over territorial control and territorial disputes. Whilst in Kennedy, for example, there is a new threat, a completely different threat, especially the circulation of pamphlets with no identification of leaders, but with signatures of Las Águilas Negras, the Black Eagles, and there have been cases of police abuse, policial abuse, authority abuse, and also within the framework of, within the context of, oh, I forgot about this. Also, the judicial framings. Sorry, I forgot about that. Likewise, in Kennedy, there have been patrollings, and members of the Black Eagles have been threatening youngsters, especially in Corabastos and Vitalia. And there's threats of social cleansing by Águilas Negras and the paramilitary forces in the neighborhood Socorro, Maria Paz. And there is a new insurgent group, armed group, Bloque Maria Paz, from the paramilitary forces. The same dynamics have occurred in places like San Mateo, Casuca, and Green City, Ciudad Verde, despite the fact that no armed groups have been evidenced or self-denominating uh, paramilitary forces that call themselves new structures. Finally, the authority abuse cases, eh, what I said about this, about sexual violence, it's not sporadic, it's permanent. For example, in the neighborhood El Diamante in Bosa, different people, members of the community, reported that some police officers were constantly attacking the people, especially the youngest women in the neighborhood. And these sexual violence cases are strongly related to everything that's been happening in the past few months after the what has been called the Bogota massacre at the hands of the policemen. In Ciudad Bolivar, the great bigger number of murders have been performed by the anti-rioting squads and the police. And in Paraíso, in the months of March and April, March, April, and May, and later on in June with the displacements. Just like that, police squads with their attacks on people and the murder cases that have occurred in Kennedy. Okay, We also have problems with aggressions and displacements to the protection centers. Many of them are in violation of the police code. And they say that people will only be arrested if they uh, attack the police officer directly. But then in this case, this happens when the person has no evidence to prove their innocence. Or in another sense, they cannot prove that they are being arbitrarily arrested or accused. Cellular theft, cell phone theft is a constant in police stations in Bosa and Kennedy. And constant threats from people from police station Caldas against recyclists and environmentalists is something that is worth mentioning. In April, there were rallies and marches by recyclists, and several police procedures have prevented them from continuing their work. They have no work stability, and so they will need some sort of support. In this case, returning to work is the only thing, the only possibility. And this has constituted a very strong factor for violence within the city, within this locality. Whilst, for example, what happened in Ciudad Bolivar is closely related to what happened in Altos de la Estancia, where this uh, attempt to displace the people was constant and always with threats and with interventions from the anti-rioting squad. And to close this, what we believe, our conclusions deal with this exercise. The first aspect is that, sorry, my cell phone fell again. I dropped my cell phone again. First aspect is that we believe that to solve the situation of human rights in Bogota, then the verification commission's role must be acknowledged, not just within the context of protests, but also in action plans for the implementation of public policy focused on the implementation of the peace agreements within the city. And second, there must be a permanent role by the public ministry for the constitution of work groups in the localities to allow for the systematization of the, sorry, that has allowed the systematization of the violent acts that we've been seeing. And because it prevents people to access health services. And we should not allow these situations and violence patterns are invisible. What we believe is that in the city of Bogota, this human rights situation is being made more complex after the peace agreement in Havana. And now it will be required to solve mainly with the implementation of the agreement. And second, with the construction of public policy focused on human rights and gender that is not discriminating or excluding to the communities participating in it. Therefore, we believe that it's very important to acknowledge every kind of community within this context, within this political context. And finally, we believe this requirement that, which Isabel mentioned during her work, during her conference, is because what we have observed is that there are cases of human rights violations in the city. Well, in the Colombian countryside, we have armed groups outside of the law um, doing exactly the same violations, and we believe that these are correlated. Let's consider the fact that Bogota has also a rural area, and some of us come from a countryside origin. Those are the main factors of prosecution that we find, the same patterns. And we would like to finish with a very urgent wake-up call to add to the acknowledgement of the work that the verification commissions have been doing and the human rights protections organizations have been doing to vindicate this work so that in every territory and every neighborhood, etc., we can have elements and sceneries that will guarantee the defense of human rights and the provision of human rights and the defense, but also to add in this strong need to implement the peace agreements. The reality is this is one of the most important agreements around valuing the human rights situation in the country and acknowledging the role played by social leaders. And second, because its implementation, without its implementation, there will be more war, more violence within the city, which will be very complex. And for us, it would be basically a diagnosis, a strong diagnosis on what we can do of the country and what we can do to change it.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, entonces me imagino que
Well,
para terminar la sesión le
so I
daríamos
suppose that
paso
to close the
a Andrés
session,
Camilo,
we
¿cierto?
must
Tú
uh,
vuelves, tienes la
give the
palabra.
floor to Andres Camilo. Hello, you have the word. Well, very good afternoon for everybody. I hope you're all well. Thank you so much to Transeúntes Disidentes, to ACEPAT, for extending this important invitation to exchange ideas, but also to um, formulate some elements that we, as organizations, as social organizations, that for us have been relevant. I will start my presentation. I will share the screen right now.
¿Me pueden confirmar si se ve, por favor?
Can you confirm if you're watching, please? Yes, I confirm. We can see it. Yes, we are seeing it, Andres. Okay, thank you very much. I'll blow up my screen. There it is. Well, the first aspect that I would like to point out is that as you realized, based on the report that we wanted to present, it has main elements or a reference framework around police brutality that one way or another is correlated to the phenomenon of social protest and how it was carried out during 2020 in the city of Bogota. But additionally, with the dynamics of territorial control that are presented uh, as it was exposed in southern Bogota. However, this does not mean that territorial control is not present or manifested somehow in other localities and regions. Especially, we wanted to emphasize on southern Bogota because there's a series of common realities, but additionally, there is a series of characteristics or features around how often these phenomena occur that we presented in the report, which is police brutality, social protest, and territorial control. So based on this, and to follow, to continue, I will try to expose briefly um, what implies or the thesis and characteristics around how we can understand police violence, but additionally, a group of elements around the patterns and follow-up that we have been conducting and within the organizations, social organizations, and that we present in this report. How did this happen? How police violence presented in the city of Bogota, occurred in the city of Bogota, taking into consideration the latest events, September 9th, 10th, and 11th, and also around the manifestations, demonstrations, social demonstrations in the city of Bogota. In this sense, I would like to share with you the following. First, I would like to point out is that how can we understand police brutality? It's important to point out five main features. First is that violent police must be understood as a global problem that in the last decade fundamentally is growing around the globe, especially in Latin America. And why is this growing? It's because somehow there is an increase of new forms of social manifestation of sceneries for marching and protesting recurrently that between 2010 and 2012, what was the Arabic Spring, in the world there have been mobilizations, but there is a direct relationship in how, as to how the state, the institutions, the police institution is acting. And here, fundamentally, I would like to point out that there is a relationship between the growth of the phenomenon of authoritarianism in different regions of the world. And in that sense, it's important for us to understand this not only as a manifestation in Latin American countries, and in this case in Colombia, but that there is a relationship with the political phenomena and dynamics and circumstances that somehow this moment have occurred around the whole world, especially on what it deals with the pandemics and what matters to the pandemics. There is also a relationship with a group of global aspects that end up in social problems, but at the same time bring about a civilian society demonstration and a response on the part of the government authoritarianly. And in this particular case, this can be manifested as police brutality. This is not the only factor. There are additional factors as well. On the other hand, one of the key elements to understand police brutality is the existing relationship between the context of social exclusion. For example, the UN has made lots of progress on this matter, and one of the elements that they point out is that police brutality is fundamentally presented within the context where there is inequality, where there is a high degree of social conflict. And based on that, undoubtedly, Latin American societies have have a high degree of this reality. For example, the Brazilian case, which is one of the countries where more police brutality per day occurs, approximately 30 daily cases in Brazil. Additionally, you see countries like Venezuela, amidst their present circumstances, also Guatemala, but in this context, Chile, for example, but in this context, we cannot set aside the reality that Colombia has. The Colombian reality around the past 5 or 4 years were one of the key factors of a situation that we've been going through is the peace process. Okay, the phenomenon of the peace process causes a series of transformations, and it makes social phenomenon emerge and cultural aspects emerge, and then police brutality it has to be understood in a different way, because currently it is intensified amidst a peace process in the past decade. What's curious is that the factor, the starting factor in Colombia is that there are new dynamics, new cultural dynamics, disruptive cultural dynamics, and that somehow they make this relationship tense, this relationship between civilians and the state. And the state and all the group of cultural social phenomena. A third characteristic is the historical relationship of police violence, starting from how the institution was created, with the national development of the country. The institution per se has as a consequence the generation of police violence, but this is tied up to organically to a group of expressions or phenomena that occur within the framework of modern Colombian modern development. That is to say, we cannot understand police brutality as an isolated aspect. We cannot understand it far from the armed conflict, from local crimes, crime rates, from the phenomena of narcotic trafficking, from corruption and lack of institutionality. It's an additional element, but it's growing because the institution, the public forces institution, um, is configured around each one of those phenomena, and it's expressed in particular interests. A fourth characteristic is that police violence recreates a group of systems of value systems fundamentally based on discrimination by class, racism, and a value system that is around patriarchy. That is to say, the police, the institution, and the phenomenon or its violent expression is somehow related to this system value that society in general, mhm, they're transversal to society, they cross society. And under that expression of police brutality, this expression of police brutality is addressed specifically to certain sectors of the population. One thing is the way the police officers act in the richer, wealthier neighborhoods where their conditions are different, and it's something completely different is their behavior in areas such as the southern Bogota. And what's expressed there is that it seems that there's an intention, a definite intention to discipline or control the civilians that are in the specific sectors, and not just by the use of discipline, that is to say, the compliance with measures, but in how it is recreated and transmitted and how the institution is okay, communicating with the population, but especially with the sectors. And a fifth characteristic is that violence, police brutality responds to particular interests. Take into consideration what has been mentioned before. Police brutality cannot be understood as spontaneous action that has no connection with a group of real facts. On the contrary, it's a manifestation of a series of interests and behaviors that defend the institution through violence, and they want to defend the status quo. And based on these five characteristics or five features, we consider that it's very important for us to understand police brutality and how it's fundamentally expressed in cities and urban sectors, because it's one of the features, one of the key features. Police violence or brutality in urban sectors in this universe of the cities is expressed very strongly, harshly, and systematically on an everyday basis um, from these circumstances that manifest in the reality of the cities. And in this case, it's the reality of a city like Bogota that undoubtedly has a connection with a group of identities and expressions around the dynamics and the appearance of social actors, which is something completely different, and we'll be dealing with this later. Based on this in the report, we wanted to mention a group of factors that we thought important, and is how police violence is concentrated in Colombia, how is it found, and how does it occur in the city of Bogota. For the national case, it's important to point out that right now the state has hundreds of lawsuits for the excessive use against civilians, excessive use of power. On the left, you can find the kinds of violence that is being exercised around these 196 lawsuits. Uh, Irregular proceedings, and another of the elements that later on we will deal with, and excessive use of power. These are the two most common elements around police brutality, everyday police brutality, but there are other elements that are more particular. For example, injuries, use of weapons, murders, extrajudicial executions, deaths by excessive use of power, and property damage as well. And in that sense, around these figures, these are lawsuits against the state. And we have 1,361 processes against police members by situations of because of situations of power abuse. In that sense, there are 82 that are only in the interrogation phase, and the rest of them in disciplinary investigations. These are official dates by the Ministry of National Defense that were exposed at the debate at the Chamber of Representatives, the House of Representatives, around the facts of September's 9th, 10th, and 11th. And on, sorry, in average, according to the police, to the report we got from the police, between January and June this year, taking into consideration that the isolation factor is very important. Here in Colombia, we have 8 cases of okay, police abuse, 8 cases of police abuse daily. And this has been made evident because of the reports. We also must consider the fact that not every victim files a report and not every victim complains permanently. On the other hand, around the follow up of police violence in Bogota, we want to present a series of contrasts between what the police have been stating around the last 5 years and the okay what we can see from the official figures around 2020 so that we can see the dimension, the magnitude of the problem. But what's interesting is that this is systematic. This is systematic police violence, and it's manifested through and through in the city of Bogota. So the Metropolitan Bogotanian Police states that in the past 5 years, there have been 1,900 investigations. But these are not police brutality. What we consider as an organization is that this is a very low figure, very low number, as opposed to the figures of police brutality, okay, especially in the city of Bogota. What we believe is that there are cases where the police have not been reporting, not necessarily because they are trying to conceal information, but because there are no complaints, no lawsuits, no reports filed, um, because the institutions make it difficult for the people to do this, and there is no follow up on the cases. In relation to this, as we can realize in Bogota, there's also two different kinds of abuse more recurrently in the past few years by the police, I insist, which is physical aggressions, which is something recurrent, but also uh, abuses of procedural abuse, from traffic fine to displacement for protection, etc., etc. And this is their relation by the information of the police with the 4 investigations of the past few years. Here we have the averages of the occurrences of these cases per locality. For example, we can point out some key elements. For example, the locality of Mártires is the one with the highest incidence of cases. There are social manifestations completely different, very diverse, and also complex. For example, around the exercise of prostitution, around the convergence and cultural aspects of the young, but especially these zones um, harbor a big portion of the population of the city. Around these areas, on any given day, approximately thousands of people can transit through these areas because it's an economic epicenter. There's a lot of economic activities, productive economic activities, both formal and informal of the city. But also, one of the places where most abuses have occurred is Bosa, and we're going to see some elements around southern localities that can be interpreted as that they will be interpreted during the report. As opposed to these 1,024 investigations, we have a very low number, which is 134 cases, where investigation has actually occurred. This is really a very minimum. This is the least. If we compare it to the number of cases that happen every day and that they have on their registries, so basically this is approximately 13%. Okay, and 13% of progress in the past few years. But this also takes the lid off many dark intentions so that we cannot continue to advance or make progress in these investigations. And in contrast with the 2020 case, we have a group of numbers that only represent halfway. They represent what police brutality has. Sorry, the incidence of police brutality in the cities. For Bogota, sorry. Can somebody translate, please? I'm sorry. Something happened. Our Portuguese translator, that was a Portuguese translator. Probably she pressed a button without realizing. Okay. So I'll continue. So in contrast, we find a 2020 reality that we want to ponder with these figures from the Metropolitan Police. In Bogota, there are relevant elements that we consider fundamental and essential to understand not just the frequency, but also the exponential growth around the manifestation of a police brutality in the city of Bogota for 2020. So the first thing that we would like to point out here is that the district has created an abuse route, specific abuse route, put in which they started to operate from March this year, and it's been made systematic. And also we can access as a civilian society, we can access these numbers and these figures. This is a particular factor because creating a route for authority abuse, police brutality, I mean, on the part of a public institution in the city of Bogota, well, somehow allows to evidence how frequent it is, the type of violence, but we can also evidence the patterns that emerge around this phenomenon in the city of Bogota. But for the particular case of 2020, we approximately have 3 blocks that we need to locate. First, 24%, which are 145 cases, and between January and the first days of September. These 145 cases occurred in different circumstances, but the particular common element was the conditions of isolation around the measures observed by the City Hall because of the pandemics and COVID-19. Where does this lead us? Well, the handling the compliance with the regulations around those measures taken by the City Hall to face the emergency of COVID-19 were attributed to the compliance or effectiveness of the institutional effectiveness of the police. That is to say, they are attributed an additional responsibility to condition them and to make them respect the rules. And that's an important statistic because this doesn't only provide a pattern, but also a phenomenon which is a product of institutional decisions that, of course, we will have to understand later as a group of contradictions around the cultural behavior of the city, the economic growth. That is to say, police is through the compliance of rules and regulations. And in relation to this, the use of power, excessive use of power, causes a series of violent events against the civilian society in Bogota. On the other hand, we have the cases that, that correspond to September 9th, 10th, and 11th. Let's remember that what happened there was a group of manifestations of social demonstrations in different sectors of Bogota, were particularly, which are consequence of murder. Javier Ordóñez's murder on September 8th at night. This unchains a series of demonstrations all around the city and triggers demonstrations all over. So then a community's anger caused these manifestations. And in that sense, this ended up in a group of practices, violent practices of police brutality. And this causes tension. There is a break on the system to conduct follow-up on police violence in Bogota. In the past recent days, there's exponential growth. 395 cases have been reported in the past few days. And amongst them, we can mention deaths, all sorts of violence, violent evictions, displacements, threats, use of weapons, and of course, murders, which, by the way, 9 people murdered, including Javier Ordóñez. There would be 10 in 4 days in the city of Bogota. On the other hand, 52 cases that have been registered between October and November of this year, which are right now being reported. Around this, I must insist that the lack of information around the formal complaint and the formal report before the competent authorities makes it a lot difficult, makes it very difficult to make progress and advance for the investigations. So I would like to share the following data that we have identified, and of course, around follow-up of this route. So in relation to age groups, the greatest number of facts of police brutality happen on the young population, especially those between 18 and 25 years old. We also have an important percentage of people 25 and older, but that's a second pattern. But the thing is that we understand youngsters, men and women, and trans communities, LGBT communities, and their group or their representatives as a focus of persecution, a focus of stigmatization, institutional stigmatization on the part of the state, but also an epicenter where the police operations, mechanical operations, is willing to violate people's rights. And around this, we believe it's very important to have this into consideration. The other element
a las localidades, algunas localidades en
is around the
Colombia, en la ciudad
localities,
de Bogotá.
some of them in southern Bogota.
Aquí lo que encontramos son las
So what we
localidades
can
en
find
donde
here is
existen
that the
mayores hechos de abuso.
localities where the greatest incidents of abuse have occurred
Noroccidental
is the
del departamento
northern
de Antioquia,
western Bogota, which is Kennedy, Bosa, and Ciudad Bolivar,
de suroccidental
which
de la ciudad de
are
Bogotá,
southern western Bogota.
Mártires
We also have
y,
Santa Fe,
y Puente
Mártires,
Aranda, que se
and
encuentran
Puente
como en una
Aranda,
zona intermedia
which are on an
del centro
intermediate
de
sound
de Bogotá.
between southern
Lo
Bogota
principal
and
que
northern
queremos
Bogota.
señalar y evidenciar
What's
es que
curious about this that we wanted to point out
sino que
within the
capítulos
context of
correspondientes
2020
que son Suba y Engativá, cada una de estas
is that with the only
localidades
exceptions of
tiene una de las
Suban and
alertas del
Gativa,
pueblo
each locality has an early stage of the
y
city
caracteriza
defense,
un conjunto
an
de
early
riesgos
alert
y amenazas.
that features a
La
series of
dinámica social de ese
threats
territorio
or identifies a series of
gira en
threats
torno
for the
a
people in these territories
la inseguridad, las amenazas,
around
la persecución,
insecurity,
los conflictos
threats,
armados que se
prosecution,
fundan en
armed
diferentes
conflicts
territorios
that
a partir de estas
somehow
manifestaciones
are
y
redundant
sobre
within the
todo
social context at
provienen
these
como
institutions. And these
respuesta
are
cuando
features originating from the, okay, these features have originated in the past few years, the past 4 or 5 years. So besides the manifestation of police brutality with a high incidence in these localities, there's a double condition, which is
de esos riesgos en
the
torno
result
al
of those
territorio nacional.
risks of
Aquí
territorial
podemos
control.
verla, que seguramente ameritaría también
So to
mucho más estudio policial. Quizás la violencia policial
maybe
es
police
una
brutality
manifestación del
is a
control policial.
manifestation of
Entonces,
territorial control.
sería muy importante profundizar en ello,
So
porque
I think it is very important to
y alrededor de los
go
elementos
deeper
que
into this
señalaba anteriormente
because
Mauricio,
as Mauricio signaled before, as Mauricio pointed out
estas
before,
localidades hay unas
and Isabel, in these
características,
localities, there are
hay
main
unos
characteristics
registros, hay
where there are
estadísticas,
registries
hay
and
unas
background
características
information and circumstances, systematic
para
circumstances
plantear esto que acabé de señalar.
to set this out.
En pantalla lo que estamos viendo es
What we are seeing on the
la
screen
recurrencia en torno al tipo de abuso.
is the type of abuse and the incidents according to the type of
En las
abuse.
cifras nacionales del Ministerio de
Uh,
Defensa,
and
las
according
cifras
to the figures
de la
of the
Policía
National Ministry of
Nacional
Defense,
Metropolitana y el
and the
registro
registry of the
de
National
policía que tiene
Police,
por cuenta de la
and the
Secretaría de Gobierno,
registry of
lo
the
que
governor's
manifiesta una
secretary,
recurrencia en torno al tipo de violencia es la física, la verbal y los procedimientos irregulares y arbitrarios, que alrededor de eso
which,
hay una
okay,
relación
what causes
constante
violence mostly is the police
de
brutality is these
violencia
irregular
¿sí?
raids
Porque allí
on the
hay unos
citizens.
focos también, no solamente
Here there
jóvenes
are
que se
focuses of
dedican a
violence, not only the young
la
ones, as was pointed
radicalización
out previously, but also the
alrededor de
informal
los riesgos del
vendors
desarrollo local. Mire,
based on economic
esto
activities.
ubica en los medios de
This
transporte
is
público,
distributed
en
in
transporte público,
coexistence in
en
public
zonas de la ciudad,
transportation,
en zonas
of
ubicadas
course, the
cerca
coexistence
de
in high
conglomeraciones.
social conflict areas.
Pero este es el tipo de
But
violencia
this is the type of
grave y
violence that
recurrente,
is more
lo cual, si bien no es
recurrent, more
del
common.
todo grave un procedimiento, por
As much
ejemplo,
as it is not
de captura
entirely
de identidad,
serious to
no hay
conduct a
forma de
procedure where you
negarlo
take somebody's
que
ID,
son unos
we cannot
fenómenos
minimize the
irregulares
fact
y
that there
irregulares.
are
Y
lots of
alrededor
irregular
de eso, como
proceedings
hemos
around
señalado,
it.
hay una
So I would
serie
like
de
to point out that there are a
falencias
series of
de
failures
policía, ¿sí?
in
Porque
the police
si
code
bien hay muchos elementos específicos,
because
también hay
as
otros
well as there are
elementos que
many
generan
specific
espacio
elements,
para
there are
ambigüedad.
many other elements that are ambiguous and that are subject to misinterpretation
Cómo actuar ante una
um,
circunstancia de
on
estas,
how
de
we
estas
should
de fuerza
act
pública.
when faced with a situation
Según lo
like
que usted
this.
decía,
So
eh,
law enforcement
puede,
can,
digamos,
let's say,
decir que
can
usted está
claim that
en medio de una
that you're in the
eventualidad de un
middle,
delito, ¿sí?
that you're
Y
committing a
usted puede
crime
estar exaltado. ¿Mm?
just
Entonces,
because la exaltación quiere decir just because you are angry.
no son unas
So the
medidas
degree of
de
anger is not measured
responsabilidad del policía
is measured only by the police officer's subjectivity, and this is important to take into consideration, and especially around the type of recurring abuse, which is abuse in irregular proceedings. There is a lack, there are failures represented in the police code. Likewise, there are other types of violence that are represented in threats, sexual abuse, micro traffic, and in this sense, I would like to emphasize on the following figures that I believe are important. Sexual abuse in the city of Bogota, at the hand and direct responsibility of law enforcement, the Metropolitan Police of Bogota, we have 6 cases, murders 11, including those that occurred in September 9th, 10th, and 11th. There are 2 of them that happened prior to September 9th, that Javier Ordóñez on September 8th. They had gunshots and serious injuries. Sorry, it's not 11, it's 121. I made a mistake with the number. It's 121 cases. And there are cases against social leaders and human rights defenders. We have 132 cases. And these are cases that are presented in social protest, but also around the political activities, social and psychological activities of the leaders and defenders. There's an exercise, there's a prosecution against them. Also in Mártires in Santa Fe, that we have found other groups that also are in charge of prostitution. And this is really serious, and not just because of the number of cases, but because of the seriousness of the cases and the impact of the abuse. Around the investigations, we believe that it's important to, more than to detail each of the cases, which you will see on the right. You can see the status of each of the cases on the right. It's important to point out the following. One is the institutional management of the situations, and something different is the law enforcement proceedings. So the former could have good results, but the latter, the investigation processes inside the police, the law enforcement, I mean, besides being defective and delayed, they're not effective, ineffective, highly ineffective. We will deal with this again in the conclusion. In relation to the 592 cases registered in 2020, um, we have made progress of the 30%, but mostly because of institutional management. But the rest of the cases, we have a variable, an important variable, and it's that around 25 or 30% within that 70% have not been reported, have not been complained against, and we must reflect around that as well. Okay, because the citizens trust in the institution, but this has undermined the citizens' trust in law enforcement. We need to take this into consideration to make these investigation processes easier. Basically, people do not believe in law enforcement. They don't believe in what they represent and what they do, etc. Because what they find is that it's submerged in a series of relationships represented by the 5 characteristics that I mentioned at the beginning. And to conclude, let's say, around the final chapter of this report, we have 6 conclusions dealing with police brutality and follow-up in the city of Bogota. The first is that it's important to point out the generation or the creation of an abuse route, especially by law enforcement and against social leaders and defenders of human rights. This allows for this allows to collection of information But this allows
procedimientos de
to
confianza
reestablish
entre
certain
la ciudadanía
trust
con la fuerza
elements,
pública, si bien
not
la
trust on the civilians,
pero
on law
en esto
enforcement,
vale la pena resaltarlo
but
porque
civilians
el
on the
mismo
institution.
crecimiento
We need
exponencial
to point this out
o
because
lo que
the
se
same
conoce en algunos casos
exponential growth
precisamente
is a
por
result that these cases were
decisiones de la Secretaría de
directly
Gobernación. De
addressed
lo contrario,
by
sería
the
muy difícil
Secretary of
filtrar,
Government.
digamos, la información.
Otherwise, it would be very difficult to trace back
Una
this
segunda
information.
conclusión
A
es
second
que se
conclusion
evidencia que hay un esfuerzo
is
por
that there is
no,
an effort
por no, una carencia de voluntad y un
and
esfuerzo por la no gestión para
a lack
avanzar
of will
en las
and an effort
investigaciones
not to make progress in these investigations
de estos
by law
delitos
enforcement.
que
Around this, we believe
la doctrina de la fuerza
that the
pública
doctrine of law enforcement is
adelantado
directed towards
va dirigido
delaying,
realmente al
okay,
negacionismo
drawing out, towards
a
denying
la
these realities,
recurrencia y la
towards the
sistematización de los hechos
recurrence and
delictivos que
systematicity
se
of these
presentan todos los días en la
violent
ciudad de
acts
Bogotá.
that are presented every day, that occur every
Esta
day
es
in the
una
city of
segunda
Bogota.
conclusión que nos parece muy
That's
importante
a second
reconocer,
conclusion that we
es
believe is
que
very important.
pues hay
Third,
una necesidad
there's the need
en relación con este elemento de la confianza
related to
de
this
la ciudadanía
trust
con
of the
cada uno de sus
citizens
poderes
on their
públicos y una
institutions
confianza quebrada de la
and,
ciudadanía
let's say,
con la justicia.
broken
Es decir, digamos de la mano
trust,
con la justicia.
broken dependence
Esto
of
genera
citizens
desafíos
in the legal
grandes
system and the justice system.
para que
People do
exista
not
una
believe in
necesidad de
justice.
diseñar estrategias
So we
conjuntas
need
y
to design
coordinadas
common
para
strategies that will
aumentar
contribute
las denuncias,
to
las
increase
intervenciones, el trabajo policial,
reports,
¿sí? Al
complaints,
tener no
etc.
propias quejas ni peticiones
As
formales
we have no
presentadas ante la
complaints
policía,
and
pues
formal complaints
cómo
and
avanzar en materia de
lawsuits and
investigación y
reports,
persecución.
it's very
Es
difficult to
un
make progress
elemento de
in
confianza
this
básico
area in particular.
en
But
delitos
we have
penales
a
que generan
um,
rupturas con las instituciones del Estado,
trust issue that generates
la policía,
breakage
por
between
su falta
civilians and
de
state institutions
credibilidad.
and with the police because of their lack of
Cuarto, es
credibility.
que la violencia
Fourth
policial
conclusion is
está
that police
concentrada
brutality is
principalmente en
marked
las zonas de la ciudad,
specifically
en las
in the
localidades
city
concurridas,
areas or
que se encuentran
zones that
sumergidas en
are
contextos de exclusión y segregación.
subjected to
¿Sí? Insisto,
exclusion,
la violencia policial
segregation.
no se presenta
I
en localidades
insist,
de estrato 5 ni
police
4,
brutality
ni
never occurs on wealthy neighborhoods.
se presenta
It
fundamentalmente
occurs
en
fundamentally
localidades del sur de Bogotá, o
in
particularmente
southern
en zonas que
Bogota,
conocemos, localidades
as
como
the case we are
Alternativa,
presenting, like Suba, Engativá, Verbena,
conjunto de
where there is
desigualdades
a group
sociales
of
y donde hay
inequalities,
una
but
materialización
there's also a
de condiciones
materialization
que
of
se representan en
conditions that
la
is
segregación
represented in
social.
exclusion and
Y
social
quinto,
segregation.
es que los jóvenes
The
son un foco de
fifth conclusion
estigmatización
is that
y
the
de
youngsters
victimización
are being stigmatized
recurrente.
and
¿Sí?
victimized
Los
recurrently,
jóvenes
systematically.
son víctimas
Youngsters
de un
are
relato
victims
hegemónico
of an
construido,
hegemonic narration, of
hay
a
un
leading
relato
narrative.
hegemónico creado
There's a
que
narrative, a
presenta
language
a los
created
jóvenes
around
y que
youngsters and that is presented on an everyday
la
life. And
descripción que hace de
youngsters
ellos
are the
es
victims of this kind of
muy
speech and
dura, la
language.
descripción que hacen de los
They
jóvenes
correlate
es
youngsters with
severamente
criminality,
es
with social
particularmente
problems, and
violenta.
this is really
Y
serious.
la última conclusión
And the
es
last
que las
conclusion,
organizaciones
final
sociales
conclusion, is that
civiles también son un
social
foco
organizations and
de investigación
leaderships
constante.
are also a focus of
Entonces,
constant
la
prosecution
violencia policial
and
representada en un
hostigation,
hecho concreto,
not
pero
just by
eso
police brutality represented in a concrete fact,
enmarcadas, ¿sí?
but they are
Patrimonialmente en
framed
un ejercicio de
operation,
persecución permanente.
operationally
El hecho de hacer actividades
as a
en
focus
varias
of permanent
localidades de la
prosecution.
ciudad
For
y
example, the fact that they
permitir
patrol some
a
areas
las
of the city
autoridades
and that they
gubernamentalmente
are
a interrumpir
police come and
las
obstacle
las
people's
actividades,
marches and they
se
thread.
traduce, digamos, un
So
patrón de persecución
this is translated into a pattern of prosecution against protest, against social resistance,
señalar.
and
Y
this
sumado
is
a
worth
esto,
pointing
es que la
out.
violencia policial
And coupled with
fundamentalmente
this is that
tiene
police brutality, as I said before,
tiene una conexión,
evidently
una
is
relación
connected, is related
armónica que se mueve
harmonically
precisamente alrededor del control con el control territorial,
with
alrededor
territorial
de la
control and
delincuencia legal,
around
alrededor del
illegal
narcotráfico,
economies and armed
alrededor
groups
de
outside of the
la
law,
corrupción, etcétera.
corruption, etc.
Para finalizar, digamos, pues
To conclude,
agradecerles nuevamente
First of all, I thank you all for the invitation.
un espacio
I hope that
para
this
intercambiarnos
space
experiencias,
was a space for
para que
exchange.
puedan leer el informe
We invite
a
you to
partir
read the
del
report.
miércoles
It will be
6
made public
en
as
cualquier
of
parte del programa
Monday,
pero estamos tratando
especially
de
virtually.
lograr una agenda de
But we're
presidencia pública en la
seeking
ciudad de Bogotá
to
alrededor de estos tres factores.
distribute this in the public in the city of
¿Cuáles
Bogota.
son
And we want
y
people to
cuáles son
focus
las
on these three
consecuencias?
aspects:
Creemos que
police
es una
brutality,
agenda que
territorial
podría
control.
contribuir, digamos, a
We believe that this
transformaciones
agenda may
políticas,
contribute to
sociales,
local territorial
económicas y
transformations
culturales
and
en
also
la forma
cultural
en que
transformations as well,
la sociedad civil
in how the
se relaciona e
civilians
interactúa en
interrelate
los contextos
and
urbanos y rurales
interact
como,
in
como
urban
su
spaces
presidente
like
que también hace
Bogota.
parte de esta agenda. Muchas gracias
We invite you to
por
be
la oportunidad
part
de
of this
expresar
agenda. Thank you for this
por aquí
invitation, and
enviando
I will
un
stop
abrazo a
here.
todas las personas.
I'm
Bueno,
sending you
Andrés,
hugs for
¿alguna
everyone.
pregunta
I'm here if you have any
adicional que quieran
questions or
hacer?
any comments in relation to what I've said.
Bueno, no, yo creo que ya
Well,
podemos dar por
I
terminada la
believe that we
sesión.
can finish
Gracias,
the
Andrés.
session. Thank you,
Gracias,
Andres,
Sylvie.
so much. And I give the word to Sylvie. Give the floor to Sylvie.
Bueno, Andrés
Well,
Camilo,
Andres Camilo,
Isabel,
Isabel,
Mauricio,
Jorge
muchas
Mauricio,
gracias por
thank you very
hacer
much
parte de este
for
segundo
being
encuentro
part
de
of
la
this second
población.
encounter of the
Para
right to
nosotros
the
es muy
city.
importante conocer
For
la
us, it's
experiencia de
very
ustedes
important to be familiarized with
ellos
your
son
experience
parte
in Bogota.
también de crear
Uh,
red de todas las
this
organizaciones
is
que
also a
estamos
way to create
trabajando
a network
por
with all the
crear
institutions
ciudades
that we're working
más
with
justas, más
to
incluyentes,
create
libres de
more
violencia.
fair cities, just
Este informe que
cities,
ustedes nos
free of
presentan
violence. This report that you're
realmente
presenting
nos muestra
really
un escenario, un
paints
panorama
a picture,
que nos permite
an
hablar
outlook that
de lo que está
allows us to
pasando
speak with
en este país.
more
Nos gustaría mucho que nos
confidence
hagan llegar
about
un
what's been happening in
PDF,
the
nos
city.
gustaría circularlo entre
Please
nuestras
send us a
organizaciones para que
file, a
todos
PDF
podamos
file of this report so that we can also forward it and distribute it because this is very important.
esta sesión estuvo un
This
poco
session was a little
extensa,
more
por el tema del
extended,
contenido que
extended
esto
longer
requería,
because of the contents, because the contents required it.
pero aún así fue más interactiva, lo cual me
We
alegra.
also wanted it
Creo
to be more
que vamos a
interactive.
cerrar, como decía Margarita,
So we're going to conclude for
agradeciéndoles
now.
mucho su presencia,
We
muchas
thank you
gracias
very
a
much for
todos
your
por estar en la
presence, not
conferencia
just you
del
for
derecho a
this
defender, sino
conference
también
on
a
the
toda
right
la
to
gente que
defend
nos
ourselves,
conectó a
but
través
also to everybody who
de
connected
nuestras
through Facebook
plataformas.
Live and every Latin
Cerramos
American
nuestro plan de
participants and
hoy.
attendants that connected through our platform.
Muchas gracias y una buena
Thank
noche
you
para
very
todos.
much. And good evening for everybody.